Good morning, everyone. Once again, we are in Perek Tet, Chapter 9 of Sefer Nechemia. And if you recall from Sefer Nechemia Perek Chet, Nechemia and Ezra actually gathered all of the people together. This major gathering was, in essence, something that we're going to be referring to later on as the Amanah, as the great oath that was taken, the renewal, the celebration. It ended up with a celebration, if you recall, of Sukkot as well, which was unlike previous celebrations because of its grandeur, is the easiest way of explaining it. And now, in this Perek, in Perek Tet, we're going to be getting down to some brass tacks of what needs to really be taken care of in all of this gathering, because it wasn't enough just to bring people together. We're bringing people together for the purpose of bringing about change and improvements within the Jewish people. And so, so it's on the 24th day of the month of Tishrei. This is in 444 BCE. This is the 24th day of Tishrei, right after Sukkot. If you recall, Sukkot was this major celebration. The 23rd day is Isru Chag, is the day after Sukkot concludes, and therefore part of the plan which is going to be taking place on this 24th day is repentance and fasting. And so as a result, that's not a possibility. You wait one more day after Isru Chag for all of this to take place. This is the position of the Malbim. Interestingly, the Tosfot and Rosh Hashanah and Daf Tet Vav Amud Bet said that the 23rd was still Yontif of that year. The Ralbag suggests that what's happening here is not only taking place on the 24th, but this is a repetition of an earlier request, we'll see in a moment, to end any of the intermarriages. And so we have a great problem of why that would even take place, and we'll see this in just a moment. But that's why it says Nesfu b'nei Yisrael b'tzomu v'sakim v'adama alehem, that they gathered with all of the accoutrements of a moment of great mourning and trepidation before God. They come together, they're fasting, they're wearing sackcloth. Adamal alehem was also part of the symbolism they would do. They would place some earth on their heads. We find this even to this day within the customs that people have. One of the customs at a wedding, not everyone follows this custom, but one of the customs at the wedding is the chosen puts some ash right b'makom tefillin, right on his forehead b'makom tefillin. There are all sorts of variations of it, but you have the same kind of observances taking place to this very same day. They're together. Vayibadalu zera Yisrael mikol b'nei Nechar. And the first step that took place was they separated from their non-Jewish spouses. Zera Yisrael here is used as Jews. Zera Yisrael in the modern context actually has a different connotation to it. Zera Yisrael means that biologically, genetically, someone is an offspring of a Jew, even though halachically they may not be Jewish. Here, Zera Yisrael means literally the Jews separated from the foreign people. What is again unusual is back in Ezra, Perek Yud, Ezra had requested this very same thing to take place, and they said they had separated. And the question is, if they did it in the time of Ezra, it wasn't that many years ago, what's going on? And so you have a number of different approaches to it. According to the Ralbag, what's taking place here is that the people who had come in the intervening years were intermarried. According to the Malbim, no, they returned to their families. Ezra was successful, but very briefly successful, and people remarried once again or re-engaged once again. They're non-Jewish spouses, vayamdu vayitvadu al chatotehem vavonot avotehem, and they went ahead and they began the process of viduing, of confessing for their sins. In other words, this is a great religious reawakening. We knew that the intermarriage occurred and was occurring during those times. It's a major problem that they had to confront. And as a result of all of that, we see the beginning, and this is the beginning of this perek, is really talking about this early process of tshuva. Vayakumu al omdam, and they stood in their place. Literally, Mitzudat David says they didn't move. Lo zazu mimkaman. Okay. The other piece is they stood because we'll see in just a moment, just the next words that they're going to read from the Sefer Torah. So the Dat Mikra says that what's happening is they stood in honor of the Torah that was going to be read. Vayikre'u b'sefer Torat Hashem Elokehem revi'it hayom. And they read from the Sefer Torah for a quarter of the day. U'revi'it hayom mitvadim u'mishtachavim la'Hashem Elokehem. For another quarter of the day, they were they were bowing down to God. They were confessing their sins to God. Now, if my math is correct, I have 2 quarters, which is half, which leaves another half of the day open. And the Meforshim try to explain where these halves, how it all fits in, and what exactly was the procedure. It seems to be, according to the Ralbag, that what happened was like this. A quarter of the day, they read from the Torah. Now, the reading from the Torah is learning. In essence, they're reviewing the things that they're supposed to have been doing that they weren't necessarily doing. And then, according to the Ralbag, they have a half a day. And that half a day they're going to use to start trying the process of being better, to start trying to make corrections. And then the last quarter of the day, what they're going to be doing is in that last quarter, they're going to be confessing and saying, we began the process of tshuva. The Gemara in Tanit, however, views this differently, and it's on Daf Yud Bet, Amud Bet, and it says very simply what they did is mitzafra ad palga diyoma me'inyanan b'milei demata. That what they did is the first half of the day, they actually began investigating, looking into their behaviors, trying to understand what are they really walking into. And then, mikan ve'elach riv'ad yoma karina b'safra v'aftarata, then the next quarter of the day, in other words, the afternoon, the first half of the afternoon, is when they read from the Torah and from Nevi'im. Mikan ve'elach ba'inan rachme. Afterwards, they began to pray to God to ask for his forgiveness. Now, what's interesting here is that what may have been written and what may have been read from Torah could have been very different. If I take the Ralbag's approach, the Torah is the instruction that highlights for them their sins. If I take the approach of the Gemara, what I'm saying is that they already knew what they were doing wrong, which is not unusual for the Jewish people to know what you're doing wrong, okay? And they on their own knew that. And therefore, what's happening in the second half of the day, the Kriyat Torah, could be very similar to the Kriyat Torah that the Gemara mentions there in Tanit, which was a repetition of almost Maseh Breshit, of some kind of readings that reinforce the fact of God being their God, the creator of the universe, the one who is in charge of all. We're really not sure in terms of the reading, but we know they were reading. Now, what's also significant is this reading, because the reading of the Torah, the public reading of Torah, was not a common occurrence before Ezra and Nechemia. Before Ezra and Nechemia, the Torah was really the property. I don't mean it in a material sense, but it was the domain of the Kohanim and the Levi'im. They were the teachers. They held on to the Torah, and they were the ones who were charged with teaching. And when you teach people, sometimes what you do is, if you're teaching the regular Amei Haaretz, the regular common folk, you may not use the text. And you may just use the text sparingly, and you may use the text for some kind of homily along the way, which is another way of saying a drasha. Okay, you may use it, okay, but they don't have that direct access to the Torah, the same experience. Ezra Nechemia, this is the revolution of the, and I use the term not in a political sense, but the democratization of Torah, that everyone had access to Torah. And so the reading of the Torah is very, very significant in this case. Everyone agrees, though, that they're doing tshuva, that this, because it says it very simply, okay, that mitvadim u'mishtachavim, we're just not sure what were the precursors to that tshuva. Was it that they learned and then they really regretted and tried to make differences and then did tshuva? That's the Ralbag. Or is it the Gemara? They knew what they were doing wrong, and then they had some kind of ceremonial reading of the Torah that may have had, it would have had some kind of religious import, but not necessarily related directly to the sins they had committed, and then doing the tshuva. Yeah.
A silly question. What language, weren't they speaking Aramaic? And if they were, it sounds like they were semi-illiterate if they heard the Torah for the first time.
Well,
How could you understand what everything read?
well, that's why in those days, and even nowadays in certain communities, we have Targum, we have Metargaminan. Okay, with the Targum, we have people who translate and explain. So you had the concept of Shnai Mikra Echad Targum. It could be what was taking place very simply in this case, that they were reading. There was a translation that was taking place with some commentary. Every translation contained some element of commentary, and the people could understand in that way. And those who could understand Lashon Kodesh were understanding Lashon Kodesh. Lashon Kodesh was not that they weren't necessarily illiterate, but they may not have had the literacy that we would assume of people even nowadays. If you talk about a religious community today, and by the way, just go back a step. We just need to go back a few generations to have some experiences of the same sentence. The Tzena Arena, okay, in Yiddish, okay, and things where people were. Well, the women weren't. Well, they weren't educated in the same way. We find that people weren't educated, but you also find that even with men, where they may have been taught how to read, but for example, up until the current generation, men, when they would come, they wouldn't have Gemara Shurim, they would have Ein Yaakov Shurim, they would be learning the Midrashim. So you find differences, and it's hard to compare. It's a different time, it's a different kind of religious experience. It was more mimetic in nature. Or just a Masorah, Torah Shabbat Peh, you're just passing things from one person to the next in nature as well. So my assumptions here, 100%, that their use of Lashon Kodesh was in ritual purpose, that there were people who understood it, there were people who could read it, but we also know, by the way, and just to go one last thing, remember, among the other innovations of Ezra and Nechemia were the fact that they changed the script. So is the Assyrian script, so it was more accessible to people. They were reading what initially almost, it's not transliteration, but it's something between transliteration and in the original script. If you can imagine, when I take Hebrew and I put it into English letters, that's a transliteration. But if I do an absolute shift, I say every aleph is an A, every bet is a B, I make that absolute. It's not really transliteration in the same sense. When you change the alphabet, they change the alphabet, or nowadays it's real easy. You just select all, you shift the font. You go from Old Hebrew to Ktav Asherit. It's a shift of the font, but that was a major shift to be able to give it, again, more access. So there were people who could read. They may not have been able to read the Old Hebrew script. They could read Assyrian script. Those were people, obviously, who came back from the Galut. There were educated people. There were people who were not educated, but this is that mass gathering of all. And there were and most likely there were Meturgamanim there. There were people who were, as they were reading, were translating. The Gemara, both in Megillah and in Tanit, where they talk about this, the idea of Targum, okay, the reason we say Shnai Mikra Echad Targum is because since there are halachic pieces within the Torah, they would translate verse by verse. They wouldn't take, in Navi, they were allowed to do 3 verses, and then translate it, because there it was more ethical, moral teachings versus the Torah, where you don't want to make any mistakes. So there was a precise translation. Long piece on this, but good. They vayakumu alamdam. I'm going back to the beginning of Pasuk Gimel. Vayikru b'sefer Torah Hashem Elokim. Revit hayom mitvadim mishtachavim laHashem Elokim. So they divided the day, and the day was for reading Torah. The day was doing tshuva. Vayakom al ma'aleh haleviim, and then on the platform of the Leviim, on the stage of the Leviim, stood Yeshua uvani Kadmiel Shavniyah Buni Sheraviyah Bani Hanani. These were different leaders. They were Roshei Beit Avot of the Leviim, the leadership of the Leviim. They stood on the platform. The Leviim stood on the Duchan, by the way. We normally think about, we say Duchaning. Well, Duchan is, to this day, Duchan to this day would be, if you want to refer to a dais in modern Hebrew, people are sitting on the Duchan. Duchan is really a bima, or some kind of platform. We talk about Duchaning because the Kohanim go up to the bima, okay, and they recite. In Hebrew, it's not Duchaning, it's Nisiat Kapayim, the raising of the hands. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense. We use a colloquialism for it from the Yiddish Duchaning. But the Levim in the Beit HaMikdash, they had grandstands, basically, which they used for their choir. And they got up on their elevated platform, and it was the platform of the Levium, and they're standing there by Yizaku b'kol gadol el Hashem Elokeim, and they led the prayers. Basically, they led the pleas to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They cried out to God. Vayomru haleviim Yeshua v'Kadmiel bani Cheshvanaya Sheravya Hodiya Shivanya Petachya Kumu baruchu et Hashem Elokechem min haolam ad haolam vayivarchu shem kvodecha romam al kol bracha utila. And the prayer that they recited was baruchu et Hashem Elokechem min haolam v'ad haolam, from this world to that world. Now, interestingly, the Gemara in Brachot and Daf Nun Daled Amud Aleph teaches that this min ha'olam ve'ad ha'olam, from this world to that world, was actually an innovation that was coming to oppose the position of what would later be the Tzedukim. Okay, the Tzedukim, the Sadducees, believed only in the written Torah. And in the written Torah, you will find no direct reference to an olam haba, to another world. And because of that, they wanted to make sure that there were clear mentions of this. Now, what's interesting is that this phrase is actually the equivalent, says the Gemara in Tanit on Tet Zayin Mudbet, of what we do whenever we hear a bracha. Normally, when we hear a bracha, the response is Amen. Amen. In the Beit HaMikdash, we didn't get off so easy. The Beit HaMikdash, the Gemara says, the answer to a bracha was Baruch Hashem Elokei Yisrael min haolam va'ad haolam Baruch Goel Yisrael ve'ein onin acharav Amen ela she'anu Baruch Shem Kvo Malchuto le'olam va'ed. Rather, they didn't say Amen. They would go ahead and they would have this thing min haolam va'ad haolam. It was a longer response. It was a more formal response. But if you think about it for a moment, what would normally take place is when you're in a more formal setting, those kind of responses are better. You know, you don't go ahead if you're standing on a witness stand and you're asked a question, you say, yeah. Generally, they would ask for a yes or a no response. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. It's a different kind of response. It's a different response that was in place of the general, but Baruch Hashem Elokei would be okay. Would be instead of the Amen, and then they would also go Baruch Shem Kvo Malchuto le'olam va'ed. There were different levels, different statuses of what would take place, and this was part of their response. So they, in other words, Kumu baruchu et Hashem Elokechem min haolam va'ad haolam. This is like we would say baruchu et Hashem hamevorach. Okay, same kind of thing, and they began these prayers. And this was the prayer session that really took place in their vidui. This is describing what they said when they were praying to God for forgiveness. Now, I did hand out to everyone here present, this sheet. I'll bring it up on the screen as well for the people who are yet to return. But again, I will excuse Ilana from this one. She's the only one who's allowed to still be out of the class, but okay. But having said all of that, okay, I'm bringing it up on screens just so we can all talk about the same thing at the same time. Rav Yoel Ben Nun has a very brief piece. He has, for those who haven't had a chance to visit the site 929.co.il or .com, which is the English version, Rav Yoel Ben Nun on the Hebrew version has beautiful pieces, so short pieces on each parak in Tanakh, almost every parak in Tanakh. And here what he did, and I'm just going to refer to the bold lines in the middle. The bold lines in the middle is just the 12 parts of the rest of this parak. He outlines them. And he outlines them to understand what is taking place. So if you look at the paragraph above, it's a three-line paragraph right above, not in bold. Tfilat Anshe Knesset Hagdola Potachat Beborchu. Okay, the tefillah that took place begins with the Baruch Hu. He writes, "Kamo b'tfilatenu adayom," just like we start. Shachrit always starts with Baruch Hu. Mariv starts with Baruch Hu, right? We have these Baruch Hus. Aval benusach hakadum v'amalei, but in the ancient version and the full version, Shayanahug B'Mikdash, they used in the Beit HaMikdash, but made by Sheni, that was in the time of the second temple. Kumu Baruch et Hashem Elokecha min olam v'ad olam v'yivarechu Shem kvodecha moromam al kol bracha utila. They actually used a longer version instead of just Baruch Hu. They had a longer version of it, more formal. Now, the 12 stages that we're gonna go over now, the 12 parts, just doing this as an anticipatory set or an advanced organizer, or just to give you an idea what we're walking into. The first part is going to be the first pasuk. Sheva chabriya l'Hashem levado. Okay, that we go ahead and we praise God for creation. Then we're going to embed Sheva chabchira b'Avraham, praise God for choosing Avraham, v'habrit ala aretz l'zaro, and the covenant we have that we will get the land of Israel. Kiyum habrit b'yetziat Mitzrayim is the third part, the fulfillment of the covenant of the land of Israel through our exodus from Egypt. B'kiyat hayam, the splitting of the sea, hanhagata am b'midbar, the behavior of the Jews in the desert, umatan Torah, the giving of the Torah. The fifth part is lechem mishamayim, is the manna, umayim misela, and the water that came out of the Be'er Miriam, ad haknisa la'aretz, until the Jews got into the land. So you see, we're doing a review of Jewish history. Then Vav Chatei HaMidbar, okay, the sins of the desert, B'yichud Chet HaEgel, the golden calf, Umidot HaRachamim, and the way we receive the God's mercy for us. Seventh, Zion, Niflot Hashem im Yisrael b'Midbar lamrot HaChataim, the fact that God continued to do miracles for us in the desert despite the sins. 8, Yerushat HaAretz HaTovah Mishnei Avrei HaYarden, the acquisition of the land of Israel on both sides of the Jordan. Tet, Hamered Neged HaTorah v'Hanaviim, the rebellion against Torah and the prophets, Zakot LaHashem u'Moshiim, okay, and the cries out to God and the salvation. Yud, Tochachot Nevi'im, the rebuke of the prophets, Hatzalot v'Yeshuot, the salvations and the saving, V'Hemshech Hamered, and then the Jews, as we always do, begin to rebel again. Then Yud Aleph, the 11th part, will be Rachmei Hashem Shelo Lechalot et Amo Gam B'Churban, the mercy of God that He didn't destroy the Jewish people even at the time of the Churban Bayit, when He destroyed the Beit HaMikdash, V'Hatlaot Me'az, and the other problems we've had from then. Then Yud Bet, the last piece is going to, the parak will really end with Tziduk Hadin, with understanding the righteousness of God's judgment, V'Teur Matzav Hador, and a description of where they were at that time, Bavdut U'V'Tzara Gdola, that the Jewish people were still in slavery. In this case, they were slaves to the Persian Empire, and ultimately with that slavery as well, they were still oppressed. That's what we're going to be walking into right now, and that's the reason I shared with you this page. And just to go back into the text itself, we'll see the beginning of this review of Jewish history. The purpose of the review of Jewish history is just to remind us how far we have come, our sins, but also the more you learn Jewish history, the more you realize that no matter what we do, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is on our side. He may punish us, but at the end of the day, there's still hope. Well, that's what these people want. They've rebuilt the Beit HaMikdash. They've finished fortifying the city of Yerushalayim. Remember, the population is still not enough to support the security of Yerushalayim, but they're now coming together, renewing a covenant with God. That's the amanah that you will see referred to directly in next week's parak. And then each step along the way, they're looking for God to be able to help them from their source. Well, how do you look for God to help from the source? Let's talk about what precedent is, and they find the precedent. And so we start with Pasuk Vav, and Pasuk Vav says, "Atahu Hashem levadecha." You're God on your own. You're unique. Ata sita tashamayim shmei hashamayim v'chol tzva'am. You created the heavens, shmei hashamayim. Thus, what is above the heavens, okay? The Ibn Ezra talks about space. He talks about Hagalgalim ha'elyonim, the Chalal b'shamayim, space itself, and V'chol tzva'am, and obviously the stars and the constellations, Ha'aretz v'chol asher aleha, and you also created the earth and everything that's in the earth. Hayamim v'chol asher bahem, okay, everything that is in the seas. Kulam. and you're the one who continues to allow it to remain alive. Utzva shamayim lecha mishtachavim. Okay, and the constellations, the hosts of the heavens, to you, God, they bow down. I mentioned in today's 3-minute tefillah thing, which I forgot to send out so far, but it'll come out right after the shir, that if you remember in the Aleinu, okay, we just remember the opening lines. Okay, Aleinu shebech l'dorokol teit liyotzer bereshit. It isn't liyatzar, but yotzer. It's a present, what we'll call present tense, because we take the approach that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't just create the world and set things in motion. That was, by the way, the approach of non-Orthodox movements. In fact, the classic approach of in the the 80s was very popular with Harold Kushner and why do bad things happen to good people in the conservative movement, because they felt, well, don't blame God. He set everything up and people go ahead and violate what God wanted you to do. So blame people, don't blame God. We say God is actively involved in everything. And that's why it says, that's what we're trying to say. You're keeping them all alive. You're the one who's the source of life for everything. Now, some of this should sound a little familiar because this comes in our daily tefillot. You are Hashem who chose Avraham Votzetomi Ur Kasdim, and took him out of Ur Kasdim, V'samta Shemo Avraham, and gave him the name of Avraham. Umatzata levavo ne'eman lefanecha, and you found that his heart was true with you. Ne'eman lefanecha, and this the Malbim says, how did you find that his heart was true with you? Through all of the tests that you gave him. Okay. Vayamin B'Hashem, in yesterday's parsha, we also see the same terminology used about Avraham, that he believed in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore, v'charoti mo'abrit. And therefore, because he was faithful to you, you therefore were willing to enter into a covenant with him. Let's say there it's a Kananiyah, Chitiya, Ha'emoriyah, Va'prizi, Va'yevusi, Va'girgashi, Latet L'zaro, to go ahead and give the land of these nations to his offspring. And what you did was fulfilled. Now, there are some nations which are not mentioned, and this the Ralbag points out. Okay, the Keni, the Knizi, the Kadmoni, there are some nations that were not mentioned. And the reality is because those other nations still hadn't been set aside yet. These nations that are mentioned, what we took care of. Ki tzadikata, because you're righteous, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Vateret oni avotenu b'Mitzrayim, and then you saw our suffering in Egypt. V'zakatam shamat al Yamsuf, and you also heard when the Jews were crying out to you over the sea when they thought that all was lost. Vatiteno tot muftim b'Faro, and you placed all of these signs and symbols before Paro v'chol avadav v'chol am artso, and all of his servants and all of the Egyptians. Ki adata ki ezidu alehem, v'taslach Hashem kayom hazeh, and you created your name for yourself. Okay, because ki adata ki ezidu alehem, says the Malbim, because you know that they had responsibility. They made it even worse than it was supposed to be. Okay. Vayam bakata lifnehem. Now we go to the splitting of the sea. The sea split. He went through the sea on the dry land, and those who chase after them, you threw them into the depths, just like a rock would sink in mighty waters. Now we're in the desert already, and in the desert, we have other protection. Hinchitam yomam, and with the Amud Anan, with the cloud of glory, you directed them. Okay, Yomam Rashi says b'chol yom vayom, constantly, uvamud eish laila, and with the pillar of fire you directed them at night, la'ir lahem, to provide for them the light, et haderech asher yelchu bad, so that they know which path to go. Ve'al har Sinai yaradata, you came down on Mount Sinai, and you spoke to the Jewish people from the heavens, and you gave them mishpatim. Mishpatim, explains the Malbim, these are the mitzvot ben adam lechavero. Okay, righteous statutes, v'torot emet. Okay, Torot Emet, this is the teachings of faith. You gave them. Chukim, okay. Chukim are the laws that we have, that are chukim. Chukim like kashrus. You can explain whatever you want to explain, but there's no explanation for it. V'Torah, okay, and also the teachings. I'm sorry, skipped a line. Torot emet chukim u'mitzvot tovim. Okay, and also mitzvot that provide goodness in the world. Those could be the mitzvot that teach you about usury, that teach you about, the Malbim talks about lending, how you're supposed to lend money to people. We also have these goodness, normally, it's always interesting in the non-Jewish world, do a mitzvah. Okay, now when you say do a mitzvah, normally in the non-observant world, do a mitzvah does not mean fast on a Asar B'Tevis. Okay, it doesn't mean daven. Okay, do a mitzvah is do a good deed. Here, actually, umitzvot tovim are those commands, not that there are bad commands, but those commands that you might want to even call, and I'm sorry to use this term because it means so many other things, tikkun olam. Those commands that are for the goodness of society and for humanity versus those commands that are for the goodness of us to lift us up before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It could be, those could be in there as well. Those could be in there as well. Bet Shabbat Kodshecha Hodat Lahem. Now, fascinating, Shabbos is mentioned separate from all of the other pieces. And the reason why it's mentioned, because Shabbos is so unique and so significant for all of our belief. If you accept Shabbos, that means you accept God as the creator. If you accept Shabbos, you're accepting a difference, hivdalta, vikidasha, that there are differences in this world. God creates differences, and the fact that we have differences is the significance of Shabbos. All of that is, as the Ibn Ezra says, okay, specifically, Ibn Ezra's words is ki nichbedet b'menucha v'tosefet seicha. Okay, there's this great advantage. Umitzvot. I'm sorry. Umitzvot v'chukim v'torah tziviti lahem b'yad Moshe avdecha. And you gave all of these other commandments, okay, through Moshe. Now we already had in Posuk Yud Gimel all of those commandments. So why do I repeat the commandments again? The Malbim suggests. And the Malbim takes the approach, there are two different approaches of how the Torah was written. Was the Torah written and concluded at Sinai, or were the parts of the Torah up to Sinai concluded at Sinai, and then as the years went on, the rest of the Torah was communicated to Moshe up until right before his death, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him or possibly tells Moshe Rabbeinu, according to another opinion, that those last psukim are going to be describing last 8 psukim, which talk about his death, even to there. Is it a gradual piece? And in this kind of case, the Malbim says that this text seemed to support the position that it was gradual. First at Sinai, there was that whole group of mitzvot, and then he gave it to it one more time. From Sinai to Midbar Paran, right before they go into Eretz Yisrael, he gives them the rest of it. And it's given the rest biyad Moshe avdecha. V'lechem mishamayim natat lehem. Okay, you gave them the man, l'riv'am, to satiate their hunger, mayim misel otzeit lehem litzma'am, and the water you gave them as well. V'tomer lehem lavo l'reshet ha'aretz asher nasata yadcha l'teit lehem. And you told them, go inherit the land. V'hem va'avotenu hezidu. And they, va'avotenu, did wrong. The vav here is not a vav chibur. This is not a one group and another group, but rather this is what's called the vav mefareshet. It's a vav which explains the hem. Who are the hem? Avotenu. What's the advantage of saying they are forefathers? Because they is an anonymous group that I have no relationship to. Our forefathers, I have a relationship. Okay, there's a famous difference right before we say vidui. Okay, the last words right before Hashamnu, aval anachnu vavotenu chatanu. We and our forefathers have sinned. According to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, we don't blame our forefathers. And in fact, if you remember, the old Birnbaum Machzer followed the approach of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and Rabbi Birnbaum only had Vanachnu Tanu. And so when we were using the old Birnbaum here, everybody knew you had to throw in Avotenu as well. Okay. Now, the fact that you say Avotenu is not so much to blame Avotenu, but to say this is a pattern. Vehem Avotenu, our forefathers made mistakes. I'm not saying, hey, it's not my fault, it's their fault. I'm saying this is a pattern that we've had. And this is a pattern of Jewish years. Yeah. Huh? Oh, so here it's just in his, we don't learn, the same way we'll do in a Chumash. Vehem, the people, all who have been described above, who were our forefathers. That's the way you would do it. Vehem vavotenu hezidu, they committed sin. Yeah.
Does that mean we never learned from
Have we? Have we ever learned? We've learned, but we haven't made it all the way. We continue to do, look at this generation. We still continue, there are so many things that are going on in the world today that if we had that benefit of looking at it, I'm sure when we will look at it, and with hindsight, at some point we're going to say, what were we thinking? Okay. We have, right now, the greatest opportunities, the greatest freedoms, and we can go in Israel, we can go in the United States, we can go Orthodox community, we can go broad community. And I'm sure in 100 years from now, people will go back and say, here was a missed opportunity, and here was a missed opportunity. So some things we learn and some things we don't learn. There's some things that are better now and some things that are not better now. Okay, yeah.
But this is a downright accusation. He's not saying katan. He's saying you need it.
Right.
This is way more.
But remember what we're coming.
Are allowed to.
So if we look, the reason I don't have an issue is because they themselves are going to be taking on the responsibility of Zadon for themselves. And they're saying these were things they knew better. These were people. Well, if you think about it, the Dor Midbar, they saw Nisim every single day. How could they go ahead and rebel? Looking in hindsight, it's really complicated. Reb Moshe has this wonderful piece about the Egel, which we'll touch on in a second. The Egel Azahav, Reb Moshe says, how is it possible? They heard God's voice, and 40 days later they build an Egel. And he said, you could take the approach of the Ramban that this was just an intermediary, and this was this, and it wasn't really idolatry, but still it was wrong. How is it possible? So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky writes, the reason it was possible is because you also have to understand where they were coming from. They were living in a world where everything was miraculous and completely their existence, their daily existence was dependent on miracles. And all of a sudden, they found themselves in a situation where the person who had been the conveyor of those miracles on behalf of God was not there. It wasn't a question of just following idolatry. They found themselves in an existential danger, and their response was wrong. But you got to put yourselves a little bit in their foot. But here they're saying they did it. They want to be able to explain, listen, they did it consciously. This door does it consciously, and it's hard. The apologetics are possible, but when you see everything, it's hard. So, and they were stiff-necked. Now, stiff-necked is a wonderful term. It says this is poetic in nature, not that they really had stiff necks, but rather it was as if their neck was stiff and they couldn't turn to God. Okay, so your neck is stiff. The Chassam Sofer has a beautiful piece on Am Kshe Oref. He says Am Kshe Oref, what it means is your neck is so stiff you can't turn around and look at your history. You don't look back. You only look forward, and that's a danger to have. Stiff-necked people is lashon melitza. Mitzudat David says it's poetic in nature, it's wonderful, but that's what they did. So they were v'lo sham'u et el mitzvotecha. They didn't listen to your commands. Vayima'anu lishmoa. They refused to listen. Okay, they didn't listen. Now, who are they refusing to listen? They're refusing. Says the Rabbah to Yoshua and Kalev. V'lo zachruni flotecha, and they didn't remember your wonders, asher asita, which you just done for them. I'm putting in the word just, which you did for them. Vayakshu et arpam, and again they were stubborn again. Vayitnu rosh lashuv la'avdutam Miriam, and they wanted to head, and because of their rebelliousness, their Mary, they were willing to go back into slavery. And despite it all, God, because of who you are, you didn't forsake them. You had every right to, but you didn't. They even did an egel masecha. They built a golden calf. Now it's interesting. It's a little bit out of order. The meraglim come after the egel. So the way you have to say, the Malbim explains this, af ki asu lahem egel masecha, is despite the fact that they had already built an egel, and then they wanted to go back to Egypt. Okay, in other words, that this, even though they built an egel, was really continuation of the previous pasuk. The previous pasuk was they wanted to go back to Egypt. They didn't want to listen to you, and you had mercy on them. And you had mercy on them despite the fact that this wasn't the first time. They had committed the horrific crime of the egel. And they said, this is our God, who took us out of Egypt, and they did all sorts of things to create shame and anger. You didn't leave him in the desert. You didn't remove the cloud of glory that was able to direct them in the way. And the fire, pillar of fire that gave them to lit the road to show them the way. Interestingly, just a side piece is the main message here is no matter what they've done, lo azavtim, you haven't forsaken them. Now, the more I can say lo azavtim, I can then go ahead and now say, hey, God, we've got precedent here. We're really miserable, but you're always with us. We were really miserable now. Stay with us, please. Precedent. We don't want you to change your approach. That's what all this is about. But if just for those who like dikduk, which is probably one or two of us, if you notice there's a strange word in the middle of Pasuk Yutet. Behaderech. This is the original form. Nowadays, whenever you have a bet or any other, one of the otiot bachlam, bet chaf lamed mem, which would normally be it's in this, it's to this, it's from this, right? It's like this, and you have a hey hayidiyah, and you have the hey, which is the identifying hey. You then end up putting them together. You say nowadays you would say baderech. You wouldn't say behaderech. Okay, you'd say baderech. But this is the earlier form of Hebrew, and therefore it's still, usually baderech, it's still behaderech in the earlier form, where you have two prefixes, one after the next, instead of contracting them to a single prefix. Beruchacha hatova. Okay, and natata lahaskilam. And you went ahead and you gave them still from your spirit to enlighten them. The Ibn Ezra says that this is referring to the time, if you remember, in Sefer Bamidbar Perek Yud Aleph, where Vayatzal min haruach. Remember, we're bringing together the Shivim Zekanim. This is the story of Eldad and Medad, who were left out because there are 12 tribes, and you're taking 6 people from every tribe. You end up with 72. 2 people were left out, Eldad and Medad. Yoshua comes, and he complains to Moshe Rabbeinu, Klaim, destroy them. They're prophesying. Moshe Rabbeinu says, Lu, if only everyone could have that kind of power. You gave that. Umancha lo manata mipihem. Okay, umayim natata lahem litzma'am. And your man, you didn't stop. And your water, you gave them because they were still thirsty. For 40 years, you took care of them in the desert. They never were missing anything. Salmotehem lo valu, their clothing never became ragged. Viraglehem lo batseku, and their feet were never swollen. This batseku is an interesting term. And Sudat David says, what's batsek? It's dough. Batseku, dough, D-O-U-G-H. Okay, dough rises. Okay, when it rises, it inflates like this. So when we use the word, batseku, their feet never swelled, just like dough would rise. Vatiten lehem mamlachot va'amamim v'tachlikem lefe'ah, and you gave them these other nations, and they divided lepe'ah. Now, pe'ah, if you remember, is one of the mitzvot. We have a pe'ah is when we talk about pe'ah, like it's a corner of a field, or pe'as, the corner of your hairline. Okay, pe'ah to the corner. So there's a question of who did you divide up? So one possibility is Rashi just says that the Jews, you separated the Jews, you let the Jewish people be on their own, because it's better than when we're mixed up with all the non-Jewish cultures. The Mitzudat David disagrees, and he says, no, you made them, you pushed out the non-Jews into the corners, out to the outskirts, and you gave the Jews the main part. Okay, and the Malbim says, no, that's talking about the fact that you divided the Jews and you had the people in the Transjordan, the 2.5 tribes in Transjordan, Reuben, Gad, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe, were over there. And that's the possibility. Vayirshu et Eretz Sichon ve'et Eretz Melech Heshbon ve'et Eretz Og Melech HaBashan. And they inherited those areas of the Transjordan. So that's why the Malbim says, he says, when you talk about putting them out to the corner, which corner we're referring to? Well, the rest of the pasuk tells us it's the Transjordan region. The other Meforshim would say, no, they pushed them out to the corners, and let's take Rashi's approach, and they also inherited those lands. Same thing would most likely be the Mitzudat David, that Rashi says they pushed, the Jews had their own section, and they also inherited. The Mitzudat David says they pushed out the non-Jews, and even in Transjordan, the same thing was accomplished. Uveneim hirbita, and their children hirbita kechochvei hashamayim. You grew them like the heavens of the earth, like the stars of like the stars of the heavens. You brought them into the land which you told your forefathers that they would be able to receive. Now, and they went ahead, they inherited the land, and the people of the land were subjugated to them, and they were given over in their hands. They could do whatever they wanted to do against these non-Jews. And now this is very similar, by the way, when you go into Sefer Dvarim Perek Vav, Psukim Yud and Yud Aleph, very similar words to this. And they captured fortified cities, and fruitful land, and they captured, or they inherited, houses that were filled with all goodness, barot, chatzuvim, kramim, v'zeitim, v'eitz machal larov, that included reservoirs, and included vineyards and olive orchards, and fruit trees, vayochlu, vayisbeu, vayashminu, and they ate and they were satisfied and they became fat. Vayit adnu b'tuvcha hagadol, and they began to enjoy the great goodness that you gave them. The leit aden is not necessarily a good joy. Okay, it's like I don't know how you say it, but my guess is it's if you imagine a minute, they were spending too much time at the spa. Okay, they weren't spending time doing things positive. Vayamru vayimrudu bach, and they went ahead and they defied you and they rebelled against you. Vayashlichu et toratcha achrei gavam, they threw your Torah behind their backs. Vetneviyecha haragu, and they killed the Nevi'im. This is Malachim Aleph Yutet. In the times of Achav we find this. Asher he'idu vam lahashivam, the Nevi'im who wanted them to come back and do tshuva elecha. V'yasuna atzot gedolot, and they did terrible things. Okay, they did all sorts of rebellious and challenging things. Those are the atzot gedolot. And we're almost up, so we may have to finish this parak next week. Batitnem biyad zarehem, and you, God, gave them over to those who were their enemy, via Seru Lahem, and they made it difficult for them. The Malbim says this is all taking place, we're talking about the time of the Shoftim. Uve'ed saratami yitzaku elecha, and they cried out to you in their troubles. Ba'atami shamayim tishma, and you heard them from the heavens. Uchirachamecha rabim titen lehem moshiim, Vayoshi'um miyad tzarehim. And in your great mercy, you gave them people to save them, and you saved them from their enemies. And then as soon as it was quiet, they began to do the bad again. And you let the enemies oppress them. And nevertheless, you heard, and they cried out to you, and you heard them, and you saved them through your great mercy. Vatad,
Who would you consider the most?
the Moshim are the Nevi'im and the Shoftim. Okay, the people who save them. And in fact, I'm going to stop here also. We're going to pick the end of this parak up of Pasuk Chavtet next week. We're going to pick it up because we run out of time. I guess I got a little bit too far off the subject on some things. We'll pick it up, and next week is a great parak because it's the Amanah itself, and we'll take it from there. Everyone have a very, very good day. Bye-bye. And if you didn't finish